Oh, nice. You haven't done that for a while. It is. Bring on the seminar. All right, everyone. Yep, thanks for coming today to the Thursday seminar. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Chris Free from UC Santa Barbara. If you're a student, there's a sign-up sheet up here. Come please sign in. And then afterwards, after the question session, we will have a happy hour. So please join us, stick around. Such a nice day. Beer provided by the Brew Club, and you continue to chat with Chris. So a little bit of background. So Chris is research faculty at the Bren School for Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. He did a postdoc there and then beforehand. And he's worked with both the Environmental Markets Lab and the Sustainable Fisheries Group. So a little bit more about his background. He got his bachelor's degree in conservation biology from Middlebury College in Vermont, where he started out studying population dynamics of mahogany forests. Then after that, he took a couple years off before grad school, started doing some marine work. That was checking out the BP oil spill and impacts. Then after that, he decided marine science is definitely the way to go. He went to Rutgers and got a PhD in oceanography, studying fisheries management in the face of climate change. And he's continued on in those directions ever since. So his research is focused on understanding the impacts of climate change on marine fisheries and on designing and testing management strategies that are adaptive to these impacts. So this work involves lots of data wrangling, modeling, and synthesis. And Chris is an absolute wizard in analyzing large, complex data sets. I've seen this in person. Rick and I are working with him on an NC's working group that's studying the effects of California's MPAs, the big decadal review, trying to synthesize everything that's happening. And we'll be in a meeting. Chris will go scrape the internet for a bunch of data from iNaturalist while we're just talking about maybe this would be a good idea. 10 minutes later, he has 20 figures to show us of how he's analyzed data. It's impressive. So he's a really strong quantitative scientist. Right, so as I said, he's interested also in marine protected area science, looking at bycatch avoidance, the effects of harmful algal blooms, and the current and future role of seafood in human nutrition. I looked at Chris's CV. It is impressive. He's published over 25 papers, maybe another one today, including 4 publications in Nature, 2 of which he was the first author, 1 in Science, of which he was the first author, and many others in top fisheries and conservation journals. So, you could say he's a rising star, but I think he is a star. He's already proved. And so I'm really excited to have Chris here today. Tell us about climate resilient fisheries management in California. Way to go.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction, Scott, and for the invitation to come and present to you all, and for Roxanne for hosting this visit, organizing this for me. It's so great to finally be in a seminar room giving a talk in person again. I think this is my first in-person seminar since 2020. So it's really meaningful that it's here. I can literally see the ocean from the podium. And I'm here to talk about one of my favorite topics, climate resilient fisheries management in California. And it's nice to be talking about it with a bunch of California-based marine scientists. So the work that I'm going to present today is sort of pulling from a bunch of projects with folks all up and down the West Coast from all these institutions here, including Karen Forney is a co-author on one of the projects that I'm going to be presenting on here. So I don't think I need to convince all of you living right here adjacent to the ocean that fisheries are really important globally, nationally, and in California, where they support sort of millions of livelihoods, provide a really important source of food to many people around the world, and are a rich source of micronutrients and nutrition in many places. But the ability for fisheries to provide these benefits is going to be really challenged, and has already been really challenged by climate change. And designing fisheries management strategies that are adaptive to those changes and minimize impacts of climate change on the ability for fisheries to provide these important services is, I think, a really important area of research. So I think when we think about how climate change is going to impact marine fisheries, I think we often divide those impacts into sort of 2 broad categories. Fish are going to be shifting where they live, and they're also going to be sort of shifting their productivity. So this is from a paper by Malin Pinsky who looked at long-term sort of time series from bottom trawl monitoring surveys in the continental shelves of the US. And each one of these little arrows represents the direction that individual species has shifted over the last 60 or so years in that area. And the bigger arrows show the sort of net direction of species shifts within that area. So fish have already been on the move. And what they showed is that these movements are tracking movements in temperature. Fish are tracking their preferred temperatures in these areas. And this affects sort of fishermen who have to respond and track those as well, and it affects both the portfolio of species available to the target, and also it affects who's responsible for managing those resources as they shift between distributions. Let's see. And then we also have evidence that climate change or ocean warming has already impacted the productivity of fisheries around the globe. So this is from my dissertation in grad school, where we looked at how temperature change, historical warming, has already impacted the productivity of 235 populations of fish all around the world. And we found that there have been both winners and losers. Some fish populations have benefited from the temperature change or warming that they've experienced, and some have been negatively influenced by that change. But that across those species, which, if I remember correctly, represented about 30% of global catch, well, that would be right here. So about 30% of global fisheries. The losers have outweighed the winners, and we've seen a sort of general 4% decline in the amount of fish that can be sustainably removed from the ocean every year over the last 70 years. And these impacts are really only expected to get exacerbated under continued climate change. So this is from the FishMIP modeling group, who've been publishing a bunch of papers that I've really liked. They're taking all of the various models that have been developed for forecasting how biomass in the ocean is expected to change through time, and ensembling those into sort of our best available understanding of how climate change and different scenarios of climate change are going to redistribute availability of fish in the ocean. And what we see, that there are generally these poleward shifts. This is under RCP 2.6, so the sort of least severe climate scenario, the scenario with the greatest emissions reductions. We still see these shifts in biomass towards the poles and losses in the equator. Under more severe climate change, so under RCP 8.5, you see even more dramatic losses of the availability of fish in the tropics and gains towards the poles. And then this is how they project sort of total biomass to go down under these different scenarios. So under RCP 8.5, we see 18% decline in the availability of fish by the end of the century, and 4% under the least severe emissions scenario. So looking at this, we immediately know the first thing that we need to do to sort of preserve the services that fisheries provide is to limit the emissions, so that sort of fisheries management has less of a hurdle to try to make up for. But in addition to that, we need to sort of design our fisheries management systems to be responsive to these changes, to minimize the impacts of these losses on people. So we had a paper come out in Nature this year that tried to look at how climate change is anticipated to impact global fisheries and aquaculture production. and how the availability of seafood from those systems would change if we were able to successfully respond to climate change, or if we sort of continued along a business as usual path and we're unable to respond. And something that I thought was really nice about this paper is that we looked at not just at like the total amount of seafood production, but we looked at the production amount per person on the planet. So putting it in terms of food availability for people and accounting for the fact that we're likely going to have a growing human population simultaneously with the negative impacts of climate change. So this is just sort of setting the stage of what the seafood sort of production per capita has been historically from these sectors. You see that the majority of food production has been from capture fisheries with finfish and bivalve mariculture sort of constituting a growing proportion of global seafood production. So then we projected this out to mid-century and end of century under various climate scenarios. So 2.6 is the most severe. And we found that sort of business as usual practices, that is that the sort of status quo of current fisheries management is maintained indefinitely and actually sort of degrades as stocks shift management boundaries and sort of become sort of more open access. And in aquaculture, we don't see sort of progressive changes in technology that allow for more efficient conversion of wild caught feed into product, into aquaculture farm stuff. We see that we're unable to maintain current seafood production per capita in either of these scenarios. But under a progressive reform scenario where we're able to sort of end overfishing and actually sort of ramp up the exploitation of underfished stocks and do that in a way that is responsive to shifting stocks, shifting productivity, and also have reasonable but more progressive advances in aquaculture technology, we find that we could actually increase global seafood production per capita under climate change in all but the most severe emissions scenario through the end of the century. So this is a sort of hopeful message, basically that the costs of current mismanagement are likely larger than the costs of future climate change. So by correcting current mismanagement, we can actually mitigate the negative effects of climate change on global seafood production. But this is really strategic. This doesn't tell us how to do it, how to sort of operationalize those adaptations. It just tells us the sort of theoretical benefits of performing these adaptations. So what I want to talk about today is what sort of operationalizing climate resilient fisheries management looks like. And I want to do it in a study system that many of us are probably familiar with, the California Dungeness crab fishery. And I think this is a really nice example because I set up in the introduction these two sort of primary drivers of climate change on fisheries as being shifting productivity and shifting distributions. And those are not the primary climate stressors threatening the Dungeness crab fishery, at least in the sort of near term. We have these other concerns about rising whale entanglements, which have a connection to climate change and sort of threaten the closure of the fishery due to sort of too many entanglements happening. And also a rising risk of biotoxin contamination in the fishery from harmful algal blooms. So these are like sort of indirect stressors. The fishery can't operate because it's either unsafe to marine mammals or unsafe for human consumption due to climate change. And it's not the fact that the resource is less productive or has shifted away, but still a climate driver. So I think they're kind of neat examples of how climate change is stressing our fisheries systems. So this this figure right here is showing the sort of spatial temporal history of the last 8 or so Dungeness crab commercial fishing seasons. So it's looking across all sort of 3 West Coast states, California, Oregon, Washington, and the light gray is showing when the season is supposed to be open, and the colored sections are showing when the fishery was closed due to either a harmful algal bloom or and contamination associated with the harmful algal bloom, or due to marine life entanglement closures. So you see this massive delay to the opening of the season in 2015, 2016 during the blob, during the marine heat wave, that led to the fishery opening up in mid-April, when it normally opens up in November, right when sort of whales were returning north from their migration and were actually sort of compressed far inshore due to the heat wave conditions that led to near-shore compression of cool upwelling waters and the forage of the whales, and resulted in really sort of intensified overlap between the fishery and whales, led to this huge spike in whale entanglements, leading the Center for Biological Diversity to sue the state of California as being non-compliant with the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, that has since led to sort of settlement of that lawsuit that has led to these closures in more recent fishing seasons early of the fishery. So this is just, I'm just trying to illustrate here how harmful algal blooms and whale entanglements are now these huge stressors to the Dungeness crab fishery, which historically, I should have mentioned this before, this is the most lucrative fishery on the West Coast. It's central to the fishing communities. I think this is a little bit of an outdated statistic, but something like, basically an enormous proportion of fishers in California make a large percent of their annual income from the Dungeness crab fishery. And it's been historically really easy to manage. It's managed using sort of 3S rule. It's got you're only allowed to catch large male crabs in this during this season period, and it's been really profitable and sustainable under that operation until these stressors. So I'm going to talk about how we might sort of be able to rethink the management of the Dungeness crab fishery to be responsive to both the whale entanglements, rising whale entanglements, and harmful algal blooms. So this is illustrating the number of confirmed humpback whale entanglements on the West Coast over time. And so you see this precipitous rise in the number of entanglements, many of which have been attributed to the California Dungeness crab fishery or other or Dungeness crab or trap fisheries in other states, many of which are unknown but are likely to have been in a Dungeness crab fishery. And this rise in entanglements is likely due to a number of factors. One, whale populations are increasing, they're growing, which in itself introduces more opportunity for entanglements. Two, in these sort of warmer years, we see the nearshore compression of whale foraging habitat, where their sort of preferred prey, krill, offshore abundance goes down, so they'll move sort of anomalously inshore to forage on anchovies, leading to more opportunity to interact with Dungeness crab fishing gear. And the increasing timing of these delayed openings of the Dungeness crab fishing season due to harmful algal blooms could also contribute to exacerbating overlap between co-occurrence between fishing and whales. So as a result of this, as a result of the lawsuit I described earlier and just the sort of obvious nature of this problem, there's been a flurry of activity to try to figure out how to to solve this problem. And so a working group was established to sort of advise the state on the current risk of whale entanglements in the fishery and sort of management protocols that might be used for mitigating that risk. There's just been a lot of activity in wanting to understand what's going to work, what is going to prevent whale entanglements at the least cost to fishing opportunities. And simulation testing or management strategy evaluation is a quantitative tool that we can use to compare and contrast the sort of performance of alternative management strategies. So if you can build a model that simulates this whole system, and you can simulate different management strategies, you can get an idea of what the likely trade-offs are going to be among them and try to search for strategies that result in the sort of fewest whale entanglements and also good fishing opportunities. So the dream scenario is to find a win-win scenario where you have exactly that: low whale entanglements, good fishing opportunities. But there are inherent trade-offs in both of these things that mean that finding that a win-win scenario is not always going to be possible, but we can search for the best one. And we also want to find a scenario that does well in years with HAB closures and also in years with high whale abundance. And I just want to remind us that these simulation models, they can't tell us exactly, how many whale entanglements the strategy is going to prevent or cause. We can't say exactly how much catch is going to be lost, but we can get a good idea about their sort of relative performance against each other. Whether there's fewer whale entanglements at the cost of more lost catch, or there's less lost catch at the sort of cost of a few more whale entanglements. So we developed a sort of retrospective spatial simulation model that simulates this whole system. It simulates the resource, the crabs, the fleet, the location of the whales, and then different management strategies that might be used to try to reduce co-occurrence of whales in fishing. So I'm just going to step through each of the submodels in this simulation framework. So first we have a population dynamics model for crab that operates on these like weekly time steps over the course of the last of 5 or so fishing seasons. Abundance at the beginning of the season is set based on abundance estimates from Kate Richardson's stock assessment model. And then the biomass of crabs is distributed among these commercial fishing blocks in proportion to where catch comes from. And then we have a mortality term based on estimated mortality from the literature. Then we have a fleet dynamics model that is a bioeconomic model that couples fishing effort to the abundance of crabs out in the environment. So it's really designed to recreate the sort of derby dynamics of the fishery, where when the season opens, effort is really high, and then as biomass is depleted, effort sort of trails off. So this results in every week we know how many traps get deployed in each one of these blocks, how many crabs get caught, and how much the population abundance in that cell changes. And then from Karen Forney's species distribution model from humpback whales, we're able to retrospectively estimate the abundance of whales in each one of those cells during the same week. So now we know how many traps were in each one of those cells and how many whales were likely in each one of those cells. And then actually by borrowing an equation from ideal gas theory, we can estimate the likelihood of just a randomly moving whale to encounter a trap in those cells. So we know the number of encounters that are likely to happen in each one of these cells given whale swimming speed and whale sort of size. and tuned against historical entanglement observations, we're actually able to estimate like a probability of an encounter leading to an entanglement. So we're able to basically model encounters and entanglements in this framework. And then we have to layer in different management scenarios to test their comparative performance against each other. And to manage this problem, we have a few sort of dials at our disposal. We can decide what triggers a management action. So what we consider is an entanglement. So if a humpback whale gets confirmed as entangled, that might trigger a management action. Sorry for this acronym. This is marine life concentration trigger. So this could be based on the results of a survey, estimating the the density of whales in a certain area. That you could specify a threshold that triggers a management action. The management actions that we have at our disposal are either to close the whole state, close like a zone, or it could be something smaller. We don't evaluate anything smaller. And the other option is a gear reduction. And so that gear reduction could be in response to a trigger, or it could just be a statewide reduction in gear now. And then we have the scale of that management action. And this could either be in space, how large of zones the management action covers, how long they go for, and when they reopen. And we've designed a couple of scenarios, and they're sort of loosely based off of what the state is currently considering, but not entirely. And they fall into sort of three categories. One, static management. So this is categories of management that don't change from year to year, and they don't change in response to any real-time information in the water. So that's like a statewide reduction in gear, just a delayed opening of the fishery to December 15th, or the early closure of the fishery on April 1st. We also consider reactive dynamic management. So this is management that is triggered by an observed entanglement. So I call it reactive because it's not actively preventing an entanglement. It's responding, reacting to an entanglement that already happened. So sort of by definition, this is not preventing entanglements, but it is preventing future ones. So this could be a zonal closure that happens in response to an entanglement, or a gear reduction in response to an entanglement. And then the final category is proactive dynamic management, where based on the results of a survey, you might close a zone for a certain period of time. And this is proactive because it's not tied to an entanglement having already happened. I meant to switch these slides around, but I didn't want to sort of bury the lead. And this is one of the most sort of interesting results from the work to me so far, is that gear reductions, statewide gear reductions, seem to be performing pretty well. They're very simple. It's a very simple measure to implement. They're successful at avoiding entanglements because they directly address the problem of lines in the water that pose a risk to whales. And they're able to maintain high catch. I should have also mentioned before, our performance metrics here and how we compare the strategies are amount of catch, number of whales, number of whale trap encounters, and the season length. And I brought that up now because this isn't necessarily equivalent to profits, but it's probably pretty close. So in the model, what we see is each one of these represents a different gear reduction scenario. So this is today, about 130,000 traps get deployed at the season opener, and the fishery catches, 80% of its catch by week 5 or whatever. And if we were to reduce the amount of traps that were permitted to the fishery, it would take longer and longer to catch that 80% of the catch. But over the course of the whole season, similar amounts of catch would ultimately get caught. There's just a less precipitous decline in effort. So fishers would have to remain operating in the fishery for longer, which does mean come at the cost of maybe not operating in other fisheries. So it's not perfect. It's not perfect. But this is sort of visualizing that trade-off in another way, where at different levels of gear reduction are labeled here. So at 100% of the gear, you get 100% of the catch, but you don't prevent any trapped whale encounters. And as you reduce the number of traps permitted to the fishery, you see you start to really steeply prevent the percent of whale trap encounters prevented at pretty low costs to sort of foregone catch. And so this is promising to me. And what's really nice is when you compare what our model predicts against actual data, this seems pretty reasonable. So this is what percent of the preseason population the model predicts will get landed at a certain level of gear reduction in the colored points. And the black points are actual historical observations. And we can compute the amount of the preseason population landed using Kate Richardson's stock assessment model estimate. And we know from our reconstructions of how many traps were deployed about what percent of traps are out. So in this disastrous year, the fleet deployed, 40% of the traps they normally do, and they still caught 75% of the legal-sized male population. So, and that's about what the model would have predicted. So this is just sort of trying to validate the predictions of the model. We can look a little bit more sort of holistically now across all of the different management strategies that we evaluated in our 3 performance metrics. So what we're looking at here on the y-axis is each one of the considered management strategies. And then this is the percent of the maximum catch that would have been caught. So the closer you are to 100, the better. So if you were to choose a management strategy based on this performance metric alone, you might do a 90% gear reduction, an early closure, or an entanglement-triggered gear reduction of 80%, where you cut gear by 80% in response to an entanglement. But it starts to become complicated as you start to think about other performance metrics because there are inherent trade-offs across these different metrics. But still, so this is basically a metric of how much of the season is open. So a block week, how many weeks, the sum of how many weeks each individual fishing block is open. So with gear reductions, there are no closures, so the season is totally open. That's true of these reactive dynamic scenarios as well, where you have a gear reduction in response to an entanglement. And then you have more of the season lost with zonal closures. So gear reduction's still looking pretty good across the second performance metric. And finally, the really important one, this is the percent of whale trap encounters prevented. So here now, the model predicts that if you cut 80% of the traps, reduce the fishery to 20% of the traps in response to an entanglement, that would lead to the highest number of whale encounters prevented. But it's still somewhat comparable to this sort of 50% gear reduction. And this could be viewed as like a little bit less dramatic than a reduction to 20% of the current allocation. Still, it gets more complicated. There are more sort of socioeconomic factors you have to weigh. The biggest challenge with gear reductions is how do we do this fairly? Do we reduce permit sizes for the biggest vessels with the largest permit tiers, the same as for small vessels with smaller numbers of traps? The season closures are challenging because the late season is really important for small boats that have to remain in the fishery longer. The early season is really important for all boats when prices are really high with Thanksgiving and Christmas. With the survey, the sort of the preventative or the proactive dynamic measures, these ones are really sensitive to design. So you have to think really critically about how the surveys are designed, what the triggers are that trigger an action, and then we also have to think about effort displacement, because if fishing in a certain zone gets shut down, that fishing effort is going to get moved someplace else, and if it goes to an area of secondarily sort of high whale density, then you could actually lead to even more encounters. And as I'll show in a second, there could be unequal zonal impacts. And with these strategies, because you're triggering a gear reduction in response to an entanglement, and so much of the effort happens early in the season, these gear reductions have to be really big to matter. So we see that here. You have to cut 80% of the traps from the fishery to have an impact, because by the time a whale has been encountered, so much fishing has already happened. So it's already naturally reduced effort a lot. And then the zonal closures, again, are subject to these displacement issues and unequal zonal impacts. And then finally, any of these entanglement-triggered closure actions, they could like disincentivize entanglement reporting from fishermen, which presents a risk as well. And then I just wanted to show really quickly how under these different management scenarios, you might have different amounts of the season lost based on what port you fish out of from the model. So we see that zone 3, which is this zone right here outside of San Francisco and Bodega Bay, it is at risk of the largest zonal closures compared to zone 1 up here by Eureka. So you can see what ports, this is the colors are showing the sort of fishing grounds of Dungeness crab vessels leaving each one of these different port complexes. So there are some potential equity challenges from resulting from zonal closures. So just to sort of step back and summarize how this very specific project about climate resilience in the California Dungeness crab fishery might relate to sort of climate resilience more broadly. Some sort of big picture take-homes are that sometimes simple management options can perform as well or better than complex options. So these simple gear reductions might be able to perform as well as really sort of complex survey-based designs. Climate-linked management strategy evaluations, I think, are going to be a really critical tool broadly for identifying management strategies that are robust to climate change and robust to uncertainty in our understanding of how climate change is going to affect fish populations. And then finally, we've been thinking a lot about how fixed gear fisheries, where gear gets like left unsupervised out in the ocean for a long period of time, present a really sort of unique challenge to dynamic ocean management, because that gear can't be necessarily pulled and relocated in response to real-time information. And by the time it does get pulled and relocated, the risk landscape has changed. So we're doing a lot of thinking now about how can we design dynamic ocean management strategies to work for this sort of class of fisheries. Now, it was my first seminar since 2020, so I not timed this well. I had a whole next section to do, which we're going to skip. And we're going to go to the end bit. We did start a little bit late. I've got about 5 minutes, but I'm not going to, we have happy hour to get to. But I was going to talk about how to adapt our harmful algal bloom sort of monitoring and management system to be more surgical and to protect public health at least cost to fishing opportunities. And the sort of insights are similar to what we just looked at before. Where basically like power analysis and simulation testing are really useful quantitative tools for designing monitoring programs that sort of efficiently manage public health risk. And it's not currently done very actively. I bet all of you do this for all of your monitoring programs, and it's not done very actively in the biotoxin monitoring community. And that expanding spatial temporal monitoring can sort of enable more surgical management because you can respond more nimbly to where contamination risk suddenly becomes high or suddenly becomes low and fishing is allowed again. And then sort of making this argument for designing monitoring programs to reflect the sort of spatial temporal scale of the risks. And the example here for California is that we don't do very much in-season monitoring of domoic acid contamination in Dungeness crab. And I think there's some happening. And Oregon does do this, and we've seen mid-season contamination events in Oregon. So sort of making an argument for that. But I wanted to close with a little bit of an advertisement for a product that I've been working on that I think could be useful to many of your projects. So I also think that sort of increasing the resilience of our fisheries, our marine ecosystems to climate change is going to require sort of easing barriers of access to data. And in California, we're in this really lucky position where the state has been monitoring our fisheries all the way since 1916 and at really fairly highly resolved levels. I can't say this for sure, but it could be unparalleled in the world. The fact that we have divided our waters into these small 10-minute by 10-minute statistical blocks that commercial fishers and recreational party boats are required to report fishing harvest and effort to. So it's pretty amazing data, but it's pretty hard to get a hold of. I think many of us don't know that this data exists. If we know it exists, we don't know what fields are available, and it can take a really sort of long time and sort of complicated data requests to get access to these data. And I think that there are ways that we can smooth this process out that will sort of catalyze really sort of rapid growth in our understanding of how our fisheries work. One is to make non-confidential summaries of our fisheries data more easily available. So right now, the state provides sort of public-facing, non-confidential versions of this data in its landings reports on its website back to 2000, and then in these old fisheries bulletins back to 1916. But that means this data is spread across thousands of PDFs and thousands of tables and is not really usable to us. So we undertook a sort of massive effort to try to digitize a lot of this non-confidential data and make it freely available to you in a R package or in a data repository. And I think it's really useful just for sort of giving sort of context around your sort of fishery of interest, of just being able to plot what has the catch been since 1916? Where has it been coming from? Like which ports have been the largest benefactors of that catch? And we've made that data sort of instantly accessible. So search WC Fish online. It's available in an R package, so you can call these data sets super easily, WC fish, : CDF ports to get annual commercial landings by port and species. And this will include value and catch. And if you're not an R programmer, this is available as in Excel spreadsheets on a data repository. And we're working right now, so with Scott and Rick, we're part of this working group that is leading the decadal review of California's Marine Protected Area Network. And this is a project that's sponsored by the state, and so we've been in the really fortunate position to be able to get access to a really amazing fisheries dependent data from the state that is really hard to gain access to. And so what I'm hoping to do with these data sets is type up some detailed metadata on what is inside them, how to clean them when you get it, because they come really messy, and it's a lot of work to clean, and it's, I think, not something that we should all be spending time reinventing the wheel, doing this over and over again. So this is going to be growing on my website, but sort of documentation of these data sets, what is inside them, and then links to sort of detailed metadata on how to clean them, and links to my scripts for cleaning that data. So I apologize for running a little bit over, but thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Closely match discussions the crab industry has had for the last 50 years, 30 years. And it all boils down to who wins and loses is dependent upon the size of the boat you have and your strategy. I mean, a lot of big boats come down and put out thousands of pots for a month and then wrap them up and go home. And you have little boats that want to work all summer long. The industry's not been able to come to grips with that from a management perspective. Do you think that if you throw in the possible regulatory concerns that are being raised by whale entanglement, that you might be able to convince people to change that?
Would be, and what would be up to debate is how to do it fairly. Are you just reducing the permit sizes for the big boats, or are you also reducing it for the small boats? I would hope that that this would help make the results of this would help make sort of the appetite for gear reductions like a little bit more, okay, but I think the industry is just so, they're so scared of any new regulations that I think they're pushing back against anything.
So just a quick follow-up. It's been my observation that the state regulatory bodies along the West Coast have, for lack of a better word, abdicated that decision to the fleet.
Yeah.
And do you think that this may change that, and would there be some appetite by regulators to actively get the fleet to modify their behavior?
Yeah, I don't know. We can't put Karen on the spot because I'm the one at the podium. But in happy hour, we can ask her about her experience as part of the working group and what she thinks.
I'm sorry to dominate this, but it's really interesting and really a big issue.
Yes.
Could you add an additional method to what you've described by having accurate whale counts on a temporal and spatial basis?
Yeah. I think so. So this is a question I'm curious about. One of the things I'm sort of curious about, is that sort of value of information. Like, imagine a world in which we knew where every single whale was. With this fixed year fishery problem, can we still? Is that actually enough? Will that get us to being able to solve it? And I think probably not. I think you would have to pair that with a mandate to be able to pull traps quickly, and because of weather constraints, we can't quite have that mandate. So I'm not totally sure how far perfect information would get us, but I'm very curious. And connected to that, I'm very curious about could we switch to a model-based framework for predicting where whales are? How accurate does the model have to be able to sort of fully substitute surveys? And that's a question I think would be really interesting, not only for this problem, but for many entanglement related issues.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up quickly on that, because I mean, those are exactly the important questions to be asking, and I kind of agree that I think that even if you had perfect information, it's a very multidimensional process, because if you knew perfectly where all the whales were, in one region, the optimal solution for the fishery may be very different because of the proportion of large and small boats and the other fisheries that are available to them to switch to. And so there's this interaction of where is the problem area and who is fishing there, how and when, and with the whales. But I think Chris is probably the best guy to do such a multi-dimensional analysis because it really is a very complex situation. But that said, in Washington State, they did issue a springtime 30% gear reduction regulation when the whale entanglement following the marine heat wave. It was implemented, I believe, in 2019 and 2020. And I'm a co-author on a study led by Lina Ricola at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, looking at what the impact was on estimated entanglement risk to whales and on the total catch. And I think it bears out some of your points that the catch really didn't drop that much because it's late in the season. Mm-hmm. But again, the impacts and the optimal solutions vary by region and by year because of the variation in the fishery. So we could talk more about happy hour, but I just wanted to follow up because those are really exactly the questions that everybody's struggling with. Thanks.
I've heard of a few proposals for the whale entanglement issue to try to modify gear, right, to reduce the part of the gear that actually entangles with the whale, which would be, potentially, one buoy with a bunch of traps connected on a long string, so you have just fewer floats in the water, or, new types of gear that doesn't have a float, but you can trigger it from the surface and then it comes up. So do you see fishermen starting to embrace that new types of technology or changes in the gear that might mitigate these issues to some level?
So I've been really surprised that there hasn't been more interest in trawling traps, having one buoy and multiple traps tied together, because there is precedent for this. That's what's done in the American lobster fishery in New England to prevent whale entanglements. So they've figured out how to sort of implement the enforcement challenges that creates. But there is I've heard an equity concern where, small boats can't do that as readily. And then ropeless gear is a whole other, challenge. Yeah.
Technology work reliably.
Apparently. So it not only is it more expensive, but it takes longer to deploy and haul. So there's that cost. And then there's a real sort of enforcement challenge. Law enforcement has to be able to go and pull a trap to inspect that it's legal and up to code, and so you have to solve that problem with ropeless gear, and then it could also end up with a bunch of traps on top of each other. So I think there are probably technological solutions to all of those issues, but it doesn't seem like there's much among the industry much appetite for that right now. Is that your?
There is, as part of this California State RAMP, this risk assessment and mitigation program, there is a working group that's been very actively working with a number of the Dungeness crab fishermen to test, evaluate, redesign, think through, you know, and repeated testing trials for the ropeless gear. It really is that it is still a deployment and retrieval, that the time just makes it not feasible to do that. But they're actively working on solution and having things like acoustic receivers so that you can have basically on your, you know, kind of like your fish finder, have a map that shows where all the other traps are so you don't put them all on top of each other. And there are a lot of really smart technological people that are working really hard, but it's probably still at least several years out because there are a lot of challenges with that.
But if I had to bet, I bet it is the future, because I think at some point those costs are going to be worth it. After all these closures, we're just slammed. I mean, you're just watching the season getting squeezed. Yeah.
I was just wondering if any of this, I know you kind of touched on it, but if any of these models or simulations have looked at kind of the socio-economical side of it. I know obviously there's a million variables like vessel size and things like that, but how like a percentage in the amount of gear or effort or anything like that relates to profits or things along those lines.
Totally, it's a great question, and I hope the topic of someone else's dissertation someday. The challenge is in our fleet dynamics model, because we're not modeling individuals, we're not modeling single ports. It's just a whole fleet-wide sort of effort, and so I think to really get at your point, you'd have to convert to something like agent-based and have like individual boats, or at least have something that was, you know, actually had sort of like sub-fleets to get at their socioeconomic impacts a little bit better. And I just didn't feel like we had the data to be able to develop something like that. So I'm very interested in those questions. I'm just not quite sure we can answer them.
Very closely related question. Because it does seem like a lot of it keeps coming back to the size of the vessels and how these large, well-funded, massive crabbing vessels are responsible for most of the lines going out, disproportionately so per vessel. And so I was wondering, has there been any work on, or do you think that putting some kind of regulation on the size of vessels allowed to crab would help in any way?
Ooh, interesting. It could potentially help. It seems to me, and I'm just sort of answering off the cuff here, but it seems less fair to me than putting in a trap limit. Because that means that vessel size would also hurt their participation in other fisheries that they participate in besides Dungeness crab. So it kind of feels like, you know, like a less targeted regulation. But I have to think about it more. Yeah. Rick.
Okay, I've got an unfair question for you.
Okay.
In your work with climate resilience fisheries, do you foresee a time in the future where we as a society or government of people will turn the switch and dictate how the fleets fish to manage both the climate and effects and economic effects?
I think that it's possible that's part of the sort of, that could be part of like the development trajectory of fisheries. So I mean, that's like what Iceland does. Iceland's fisheries are super efficient. I think they're like, which they can do partially. Well, it comes at the cost of participation. It's a few people getting really, really rich. So that's what you sacrifice. It becomes a more efficient fishery, and but it benefits fewer people's livelihoods. Sort of like catch shares, but yeah, even more extreme.
More questions, or should we continue this for the happy hour outdoors and enjoy the beautiful weather? Let's do that. All right, let's
Perfect.